what police are supposed to be able to prove when they make an arrest for such offenses is the intent to engage in a drug sale. But if you can prove the drug sale, you don't need to arrest someone for loitering. So in the end, loitering laws are either unconstitutional because they're overly vague and give police too much discretion and don't actually specify what it is that's criminal about the behavior, or they're meaningless and useless because they duplicate laws that are already on the books. Here in Baltimore, we have various loitering with intent laws, but they were being enforced like the old style loitering laws, meaning if there were folks gathered on a corner, the police would come up and arrest them for loitering. That's unconstitutional. It's just not allowed. Again, if they had to meet their quota to show that they were arresting enough people, we had a client arrested for trespass. Well, in order to arrest someone for trespass, the property has to be posted no trespassing. So they arrest our client, charge him with trespassing. We go to the property to see whether it's posted, which is a necessary precondition for a lawful arrest, and there's no sign, even though the police officer in the charging document says that the property was posted. He just lied. He just made it up. And this was happening on a wholesale scale. These weren't isolated examples. I mean, this is why arrests went, before a lawsuit over $100,000 a year to after our lawsuit 40-something thousand a year. This was happening on a wholesale scale. People being improperly arrested, people being arrested for charges that the police knew full well the state's attorney's office simply wasn't going to pursue. Littering, for example. It's not worth the trouble to criminally prosecute someone for throwing a candy wrapper on the street, to spend the money to hold them in jail, to have a defense attorney, to have a prosecutor, to have a judge. It's crazy. But it was all part of this conscious police strategy that if we arrest enough people, we will disrupt the drug trade and interrupt the violence, and the city will get safer. And if it was true that that was the necessary condition for doing that, then how is it possible that as the number of arrests plummeted, the murder rate and every other crime rate in this country declined at an equally precipitous level? It's just, if that was the necessary cause of the crime rate, then it never would have happened. We sued because what we saw was a pattern of illegal arrests. That is, a pattern of arrests made without probable cause that a crime had actually been committed. I mean, the factual circumstances varied, but we were seeing intake after intake of people arrested, and the facts just simply didn't amount to a crime. And we were seeing these extraordinary numbers where arrests had gone through the roof, and the number of people who were for whom the state's attorney was declining prosecution had gone through the roof. And so, something had to be done. Well, I'm not even sure that I don't, very few criminal cases get tried. You would think that everyone who's arrested gets a lawyer, goes before a judge and a jury, and there's a full trial, and their guilt or innocence is determined based on the facts, and they're then punished. That's the theory, that's the ideal, but that's not what happens in real life. for the vast majority of people who are arrested, we have this insane system of cash bail that says whether or not you are going to be held in a cage prior to trial will be determined by whether you have enough money to buy your way out of jail. It has nothing to do with how dangerous you are. It has nothing to do with how likely you are to show up to court. It has to do with whether you've got enough money to put up the bail or to pay a bail bondsman to get you out of jail. And if you're rich, you can buy your way out. And if you're not, you sit in a cage. And for folks who are sitting in a cage, the consequences are huge. Almost inevitably, they lose their job, may lose their housing, and eventually the system says, okay, we'll let you take a plea to the charge and you can serve your time served and get out. So simply because you didn't have enough money to buy your way out of the cage, you then give up your right to contest your factual and legal guilt or innocence, and you buy your way out of jail by having served however long it takes until the plea is reached, or whatever reduced sentence the prosecutor is willing to offer in order to avoid the risk and expense of trial. And so the criminal justice system that we have now is not a system, we call it the criminal justice system, but it isn't really a system that delivers justice anymore. It is a system that processes poor people, that is largely devoted to processing poor people and people of color and putting them in cages. That is the system that we have. The public defender's there, and I think they do a lot of great work, but like all the other actors in the system, they're constrained by the system that we have. The public defender doesn't want their client in jail. Public defender knows full well if their client is in jail, your chance of even getting to trial is significantly reduced for the very reasons I said. The incentive is there to take a plea and get it over with as soon as possible. And they've already lost, their job, their home, their family relationships are disrupted. So, it's not the public defender that decides this is the bail system we're going to have. It's the state legislature that decides this. And there have been countless efforts here in Maryland to reform the bail system. And it hasn't happened because of the wealth and power of the bail bond industry and the cravenness of the politicians who refuse to do something different. It doesn't have to be this way. It shouldn't be this way. But that's not the public defender's fault. They don't get to make these rules. They do the best they can given huge resource constraints and the huge constraints that are imposed by the legal system that we have. If the defender gets to actually try the case and can adequately investigate the case, then people get acquitted. I mean, it's not that everyone gets acquitted. Some of the people are actually guilty. But this notion that every criminal charge results in this careful determination of legal and factual guilt or innocence it's a fantasy. And I think that the reason it's a fantasy is not because, the public defenders are bad lawyers. There are some fantastic public defenders who are, utterly committed to their mission of representing the poorest and most vulnerable people against the power of the state. But they, like every other lawyer, are operating in the constraints of a system that, in the end, doesn't care about those people. So they are fighting the system. They are doing their best for their clients in a system that is set up to ignore their humanity and set up in a way that treats them differently than the wealthy people who get charged with a crime. Well, the alternative is you may spend a year or more waiting for your trial date to come up, and then you're going to roll the dice on what the jury is going to do, especially for less serious crimes, which, again, are a huge number of the, not everybody in jail is charged with murder, right? You have, look, well, I don't want to get lost in a mass of statistics. For less serious crimes, especially nonviolent crimes, if you are, the idea that whether or not you're going to sit in a cage waiting for trial is going to depend on whether you can put up the money to buy your way out is crazy. It's a crazy system. And plenty of states have done away with cash bail. In the federal government, there's no cash bail. The decision is made based on the likelihood that you will show up for your trial. Are you going to flee? And on how dangerous you are. What is the public safety risk that you pose?
How do you change history? You can change history by walking and marching. You can change history by speaking and teaching. You can change history by taking a stand or taking a seat. But the best way to change history is when you becomes we. We tore down that wall. We marched for equality. We made sure that love knew no boundaries. Now you can become we right here in Vancouver. We can end HIV. We can change history. It begins with a test. Testing today can range from a blood test that'll inform you in about a week to some locations where a prick of the finger gets you a result in 60 seconds. Diagnosing HIV early changes everything. It prevents the virus from attacking your body, and it prevents it from spreading through our communities. All each of us has to do is step up and take a test. Changing history is that simple. Testing centers are available throughout the city, or just ask your doctor at your next regular visit. And if your doctor offers a test, say yes. It's just the responsible thing to do. Then, share the word. Tell people that HIV treatment has changed. Tell people that testing has advanced. Tell people that the entire approach to HIV is different now. Let them know that by choosing to take a test, we can all end HIV. This is a fact. We are so close. But to become we've got to have you. We need you to do your part. We need you to share the word, take the test, join the movement. End HIV. Change history. Learn more at itsdifferentnow.org.
My name's Mark. I'm an alcoholic.
Dorothy T., and I am an alcoholic.
For so long, alcohol has sort of been there for me to sort of see me through social situations.
Drinking was more important than anything else.
My journey in AA started years ago when I reached the outside limits of my desperation.
I really wanted to quit drinking, I just couldn't stop on my own. And you know, I remember when I woke up on the day that I got sober. I felt something inside of me tell me that I could go to AA.
These people, just gathered around me. That was the fellowship in action in my life.
The moral of my story today is that AA has never let me down, ever.
If I carry any sort of message with my story, it's that, keep coming back and that this thing does work.
If you have a problem with alcohol, contact AA. It works.
The promise was that these zero tolerance policies that he was importing from New York would, as he put it, make the city safe. The idea was we can, if we arrest enough people, we will find the bad guys, get the bad guys off the street, and the city will become safer. It was the theory was that we can arrest our way out of crime. And I think every police chief worth their salt that I've spoken to has said that that idea is crazy. You can't, let me say it a different way. The explicit theory was that by arresting enough people for low-level offenses, you could disrupt the drug trade, which was the presumed driver of violence. And that enough arrests, regardless of what the person was being arrested for, would have a positive public safety effect. This was based on, this was a flawed theory based on flawed empirical data, and was hugely destructive of the necessary basic bond of police-community trust that is foundational to real improvements in public safety. I mean, in the end, if there is we can't police ourselves to safety. Police, at best, can address the most serious manifestations of crime. But police aren't everywhere all the time. They can't solve all crimes. They can't arrest all perpetrators. It's just not possible. And if you want to have public safety, you have to create a society where there's just less people committing crime. Part of that is you also have to define what are the things that you are going to make a crime that are going to warrant police attention. Because there are lots of things that we have now criminalized that don't need and don't deserve the law enforcement approach. For example, the war on drugs, which has in practice been a war not on drugs, but a war on poor people and people of color. And If your concern is that drug use harms the people who are using the drugs, you have to ask yourself, how are those people helped by being constantly subject to police action, constantly stopped, constantly frisked, arrested, put in cages, having their livelihood, their lives, their families, their housing, their education disrupted? If your concern is those people, the war on drugs is precisely the worst possible thing that you could do for those same people. And the costs have been staggering, both in monetary terms, human terms, and moral terms. And this idea that we can make the world safer by stopping as many poor black and brown people as possible for petty offenses is wrong and immoral. The outcome was as would be expected, and in fact by design, was a huge spike in the number of arrests, to the point where the city jail became so overcrowded and simply couldn't process the volume of bodies, of human bodies that were going through there. And the result of that was the establishment of a triage process at the city jail, where prosecutors were stationed at central booking to review charges as they came in and to make a decision about whether the case should proceed at that very first step, prior to the person being presented to a court commissioner for a bail determination, prior to a criminal defense lawyer ever getting involved. It was triaged by the state's attorney. And what you saw with the extraordinary number of arrests, to the point where the Baltimore police were arresting over 100,000 people every year. That's about a sixth of the city's population being arrested every year. You had huge numbers of people being, the term that was used was RWOC'd, released without charge. That term, I should point out, is actually a misnomer, because in Maryland, an arrest is a charge. So these people were burdened with arrest records that followed them for life. But the prosecutor was dismissing over a third of the arrests made by the Baltimore City Police Department at that initial triage review. That is and was an extraordinary number. The fact that one-third of the arrests, one-third of the discretionary arrests that the Baltimore City Police Department would make every year were being tossed by prosecutors is a figure, I think, unmatched in any other city that I have ever heard of in this country. And that is, again, before anyone comes in to defend the person. A huge percentage of cases would also end up getting dismissed after a defense lawyer got involved. So what you had was this extraordinary situation where you had 100,000 people being arrested every year, a third of those charges being dismissed right off the bat by prosecutors, and people simply being forced to cycle through the criminal justice system. And although for someone who was really a bad guy, this was just, a cost of doing business. They would get arrested, they'd spend 24 hours, that's supposed to be the limit, maybe more, because the laws were being ignored, in jail, and then they would be released out the other end. In fact, there was a term for it, a walkthrough. But for tens of thousands of Baltimoreans, this was a life-changing experience. Being like so many other things in Baltimore, what it demonstrated was our cities, our states, our societies' complete and utter contempt for them as a human being. They were nothing more than a body to be processed through the criminal justice system. They were arrested, a huge amount of cases that never should have resulted in arrest in the first place. They were subjected to appalling conditions in the jail, to strip searches. For many, the fact of a criminal record on their record had huge impacts in terms of job opportunities. Just the fact of being stuck in jail for 24, 48, 36 hours for people often results in the loss of a job, which then results in loss of housing. And the mere fact that they are not safe, not because of violence in their community, but from the very people whose job is supposed to be to serve and protect them, is profoundly, has a profound impact. And the results, I think, were catastrophic. You had a huge breakdown in the basic bond of trust and legitimacy between the people and the police and the people and their government, which itself is corrosive in terms of crime and makes people unwilling to cooperate with the police to prosecute the other bad guys. And I think in many ways set the stage for where we are today here in Baltimore. And I think it's striking that after the extraordinary number of arrests and the extraordinary number of people not being prosecuted came to light, and we sued the city over that pattern of illegal arrests, the number of arrests started to go down rather dramatically. And so by the time after we settled that lawsuit in 2010, the arrests fell to a low where they had been 100,000 per year, fell by more than half to around 40,000 per year. That is a huge, huge drop in the number of people being arrested. And yet, at the same time, crime continued to go down, 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 down as police changed their tactics after O'Malley and began focusing on what we would expect police to focus on, which was serious crime and violence, people doing really bad things to each other. And the fact that those huge drops in crime to historically low levels correlated with this dramatic drop in arrests in the wake of our lawsuit, I think is hugely significant, and I think empirically disproves O'Malley's assertion that this kind of zero tolerance, lock everybody up, arrest everybody for everything you possibly can, arrest as many bodies as you can, was either necessary or effective. Well, one of the most important rights that we all have under the Constitution is the right to be free from, the language the Constitution uses is unreasonable searches and seizures. What is reasonable has been defined by courts over the centuries that this country has been in existence, but I'm getting too technical. Let me say it in a different way. One of the most important rights that we have under our Constitution is that you can't be arrested unless the police have what's called probable cause. That is, there has to be a sufficient level of suspicion that you have actually committed a crime. And what we saw in Baltimore is, there's a whole another aspect to this that I didn't talk about. Let me go back and talk about one other thing. One of the drivers for the huge spike in arrests was the bureaucratic approach to policing, which said, and which I think may even be well-intentioned, but which said we're going to track where the crimes are occurring, and we're going to track the so-called productivity of all of the officers in all of the districts and see how they're responding to these crime patterns. Sounds good in theory, but what you had at these weekly ComStat meetings was a constant pressure from the top of the police department to address crime by numbers. If crimes are happening here, then the message is you go out and you arrest more people here, and that's how we will solve the problem. And so there was constant pressure on officers on the street to arrest as many people as possible. And the only thing that counted for those officers, the only thing that mattered was how many arrests they made. If you made a lot of arrests, you were considered a good officer. If you didn't make a lot of arrests, you were considered a lazy or a bad officer. It didn't matter whether the arrests were good or bad arrests. It didn't matter whether or not the person could actually be prosecuted. It didn't matter whether or not the arrest was for some petty offense like littering on the street or for murder. What mattered is how many arrests you make. Well, if that's what you do in a bureaucracy, the results are easy to predict. People are going to go make more arrests, and they're not going to care whether they make good arrests, and the arrests that they make are going to be for the easiest thing possible, not for the most important things. And that is precisely, exactly what happened in Baltimore. As I say, the result in fact was, because the pressure was more and more arrests, the result was more and more arrests for petty high discretion offenses like littering, loitering, failure to obey, disorderly conduct, trespass, etc. These are low-level offenses, non-serious crimes. One could question whether they should be crimes at all in many cases, and offenses for which police have a vast amount of discretion to decide how to handle, whether to even stop the person, whether to even issue a citation, whether to issue an arrest. Not only did the arrests for those offenses go up dramatically, but you had a huge number of arrests where there simply wasn't probable cause to arrest. That is, where either because no offense had been committed, or because the person had been illegally stopped in the first place, or in many cases, they were arresting for offenses that they knew the state's attorney simply wasn't going to prosecute. So the police became the judge, jury, and executioner. So for example, as the number of arrests shot up in Baltimore, as the number of arrests shot up and as the jail became overcrowded, the state's attorney, as I said, developed this triage process to examine the cases as they came to central booking. And at the beginning of that process, they developed a form that they would use to decide how to handle each arrest. And one of the boxes on that form was no probable cause. This gets to the question that you asked me, what are the basic legal rights here? So one of the basic legal rights that we all have in this country is we can't be arrested unless a police officer has probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed, meaning that there's a sufficient level of suspicion and not just an officer's hunch or guess that we've actually committed a crime. And an officer who arrests someone without probable cause has violated their Fourth Amendment rights, and that's an illegal arrest. Well, what's very interesting is that as the number of arrests shot up in Baltimore, as I said, the state's attorney's office had this triage form that they used to decide whether or not the arrest was going to go forward into an actual prosecution. And one of the checkboxes on this form that they would use to decline a case for prosecution was no probable cause. And they started checking that box more and more and more often until someone said, hey, wait a second, we can't have, we've got a paper trail now saying that huge numbers of people are being arrested without probable cause. That's a big problem. And it was a big problem, but the approach that was taken to that problem was not to do anything about the arrests, but to simply eliminate the box from the form.
I'm here for my flu shot, and I understand that there are options for people who are 65 and older.
There are, but you don't look 65.
It's very flattering, but you know who I am. What if I said, who's the boss of my health?
You've never seen Who's the Boss. My boss is in the back.
Flu season is here, and people who are 65 and older need to ask about the vaccine made specifically for their age.
Judith the Light. Come on back.
Visit the National Council on Aging at ncoa.org/flu and talk to your doctor about vaccine options for people 65 and older.
So on page 124, you guys can find some practice questions, and I do suggest that you all take a look at these because this test next week is going to be a doozy. We will definitely be solving for x, so x squared plus 3 equals. Marshall, would you come up here and solve this problem for the class?
I can't.
And why is that?
Because I have a boner.
Oh.
I have a boner.
Okay.
I have a boner.
I have a boner.
I have a boner.
I have a boner.
I have a boner. I have a boner.
I have a boner. All right, no, boys. Come on, sit down. Class is not. Sit down. Well then, Megan, do you want to come up to the board and solve the problem? I have my period.
I have my period.
I have my period. Answer is 7.
I have my period.
Well, I mean, it is a system that has been created in place of finding more equitable solutions for social justice issues. I mean, it has really become the focus of this town. It controls this town, really. I mean, policing is the biggest business. I mean, if you look sort of symbolically in Baltimore, what are the two sort of nexus of activity? You have the court system over there, which takes up multiple blocks, and then you have a prison system that's larger up there, but it holds about 8,000 people, which is larger than any factory that we have in Baltimore. So as the city's economic fortunes decline, what grew in its place was a police and prison system that came to be kind of the social arbiter, the way to control poverty and the way to make sure that the inequities that were growing from this economic decline could be enforced and maintained. So one of the things you have to think about that's really interesting is that back in 1950, the entire Baltimore City Police Department was about 1,600 people, but there were 1 million people in town. And now we have a town of about 600,000, and we have a 3,000 person force, almost doubled with less people. And on top of that, we are the second highest police city in the country. We have the second highest per capita number of police of any city in the country. And you have to ask yourself why? Why? Because we're not safer, right? I mean, our homicide rate this year is around 320, highest it's ever been. So what is this disconnect? What is policing really doing? Well, it's not keeping us safer, so what is it really about? And I think that's the fundamental question that we have to ask as residents of the city. Why do we have this? Why, if it doesn't work, why do we keep using it? Why do we keep doing it? So I think that question in the parlance of policing is probably essential to understanding what it really is. Well, obviously, I mean, the war on drugs became like sort of a business model. I mean, people don't understand that the war on drugs was a long time in coming. It started with the Harrison Narcotics Act back in the turn of the century when they sort of partially criminalized marijuana. And from the result of that, a huge bureaucracy grew, a huge law enforcement bureaucracy. Now, you know, the law enforcement bureaucracy is billions of dollars a year are spent on drugs. I mean, remember, the ACLU in a report said that Maryland spends about $100 million a year prosecuting marijuana, right? Minor marijuana arrests, putting people in jail. Well, where's that money going? It's going in the pockets of police, it's going in the pockets of courts, it's going in the pockets of lawyers. It's a big, big business, right? So the war on drugs is a perfect way to facilitate that. What is a crime? What is a drug crime? Well, drug crime is kind of a crime of proximity, right? So in other words, I've been in lots of cases where a police officer says, I saw him near a stash of drugs. I mean, what easier way is it to include someone in the system and to get them in there and to monetize them than to say than to make drugs illegal, than to make marijuana illegal. I mean, the city was making 6,000 marijuana arrests a year prior to the recent legislation that sort of decriminalized it, but didn't really. 6,000 arrests a year, that's money. That is money in the pockets of police officers. That's overtime. And not surprisingly, 90% of the people arrested were African American, which is disproportionate to the use. So it is the easiest way to indoctrinate people in the criminal justice system. Drugs, you know, saying you have a gram of this or a gram of that. What easier way is to do it? It doesn't take a lot of investigation. It certainly is easier than solving homicides, which the city doesn't do well, right? But we're very efficient at incarcerating people. And that's because of the war on drugs. The war on drugs makes it simple. You have marijuana, you're arrested, you know, your life is destroyed, you're on probation, you're in jail. It's probably the easiest nexus for police to use. You know, the thing is that the war on drugs made zero tolerance possible. We had already sort of built up the idea that it was okay to go in a community and arrest people for minor things or things that aren't important, and that, you know, arrests somehow were productive, which is really one of the strangest ideas. You know, the war on drugs sort of inculcated this idea that arresting people and incarcerating them was a productive activity. If you can remember, you know, President Bill Clinton saying, I put 100,000 cops on the street. That whole theology of criminal justice came out of the war on drugs, and zero tolerance was an extension of that. Because zero tolerance was, you know, you had people driving into neighborhoods, you had police called the jump out boys, jumping out and loading people into vans who hadn't committed a crime or done anything but been in an African American poor neighborhood. The only way you're able to achieve that is if you convince people psychologically that somehow that's warranted or somehow that's doing some good. And zero tolerance took the idea of the war on drugs and built on it to a point of absurdity. I mean, you had many things that came up that were created in Baltimore that really had no precedent in the criminal justice system, like the walkthrough, for example. People would go to a central booking and say, I want my walkthrough. They just walk people through to get a stat. You had the jump out boys. You had people being arrested for spitting on a sidewalk. You had people being arrested for drinking a beer on their stoop after a long, hard day of work. There is really no parallel to it, except for maybe going back to slavery when people were actually able to have their civil liberties and their freedom taken away for absolutely nothing. You know, it is unparalleled. And certainly the war on drugs, I think, prepared us for the idea of zero tolerance, specifically because it said, well, arresting people somehow is productive or just. The NAACP and the ACLU sued the city over zero tolerance. And as part of the settlement, the city admitted that this policy was targeted specifically at poor African-American neighborhoods. And the statistics of the people who were illegally arrested were almost 92% African-American. So it was purely racialized. There was nothing else to it. I mean, every once in a while, you'd have someone in the Inner Harbor get arrested and it would be a big deal, a white person or something. But in general, almost always, all of it was focused on the African-American community and African-Americans. So it was purely a racist policy. There's no question about it. The numbers are indisputable. Well, as I said before, there's no simpler way to get someone in the criminal justice system than by the possession of a substance. And because in many of the neighborhoods that were most affected by poverty, African-American neighborhoods, became the drug supermarket for the white suburbanites, it became an easy way to criminalize a community. Marijuana is, I'm sorry I'm going to say this, but it is a harmless, if not beneficiary, substance. But possession of it, having in your pocket, having nominal amounts of it, could put you in the criminal justice system for years, if not, for the rest of your life, because it becomes this sort of trap. So absolutely the war on drugs criminalized poor African-American communities. A lot of the cases I wrote about of police brutality, some person would be beat up by police and I'd be writing about it. And the first thing they'd bring up, the police, when I call them and say, do you know, like 4 years ago, he was arrested for possession of marijuana, or she was arrested for, possession of marijuana, or whatever. So it not only became something that allowed the police to continue to target African-American communities, but it became a way to take away someone's agency, their ability to have civil rights and to argue that they be treated just. It basically became the mechanism for being able to treat people unfairly. Because you could say, well, you were arrested 4 years ago because you had marijuana on you. And that became, well, he doesn't have the right not to be beaten up by police. So all that stuff became part of a bigger narrative that allowed this sort of mass incarceration that happens in these neighborhoods to occur without anybody saying anything. Because they're like, well, they're drug corners. We got to get rid of the drug corners. The drugs, the war on drugs. And it all became a sort of narrative that said it's okay to do this, even though it was unjust, even though it's constitutionally questionable. So I think absolutely it works part and parcel in terms of making the criminal justice system, completely an issue on targeting African-American communities. Well, I mean, Anthony Anderson case was a case where, certainly at that point in time, people were becoming more and more aware of police brutality. The Anthony Anderson case was a case, again, where you saw the war on drugs and aggressive policing contributing to the death of someone that seems utterly absurd. He was a man who lived in East Baltimore. He was walking across a deserted lot. A police officer spotted him, thought he had drugs on him, walks over to him, picks him up and throws him to the ground. And in doing so, ruptures his spleen and basically kills him. And I think this case, as a reporter, was probably one of the first times where it sort of demonstrated just how absurd the culture of policing is in Baltimore. Because it was ruled a homicide. The officer, it was a death by the hands of another. And he had not committed any crime that anybody had seen. Like, he hadn't shot somebody or done something or anything. All he was doing was walking across and the cop thought he had a pill on him. So for that reason, he felt the need to use force. He came up from behind him and did what's sort of a wrestling move where he picked him up and dropped him on his back and ended up killing him. And I think this was the beginning case where people started to say, this is really getting out of hand. There have been cases before, but for whatever reason, this case sort of called attention to the absurdity of the drug war and how pernicious and destructive it was in African American communities. So the state's attorney then, Greg Bernstein, did a long, drawn-out investigation. And after 6 or 7 months, called a press conference and said that the officers did what they were doing was reasonable and correct. And to me as a reporter, I couldn't really comprehend the logic. Now, I mean, we have to be objective, right? So we don't want to like make judgments, but I couldn't comprehend the logic of why an officer would need to chase a guy down from behind who had committed no crime, and then in doing so had led to his death and had been ruled a homicide and was facing no criminal consequences. To me, that case as a reporter exemplified, the structural injustice that exists in this system that we call criminal justice. I mean, there was no way that I could see to rationalize that kind of ruling on a logical basis. It didn't make any sense. And I think that was one of the first cases where I think the community was starting to say, okay, enough of this. Because there was a lot of that in the Tyrone West case, there was a lot of attention paid to it. There was enough attention paid to it that Greg Bernstein, the state's attorney at that time, felt the need to call a press conference to explain it, even though I think his answer didn't sit well with the community. But it certainly was the first case where there seemed to be a communal response saying, wait a second, there's no reason for this. And it certainly is understandable why it's inexplicable to anybody who witnessed it or recovered it. Well, first of all, you've got to take out the incentive of the drug war and stop making policing about money. You have a $500 million a year industry where most of the people live outside the city. And you have to somehow defund that idea that arresting and locking up more people means more money for people who don't live here. But secondly, you have to change the nexus of power, which means, right now the mayor pretty much has control of the police department. And the mayor, has a great incentive, both financial and politically, to do whatever the police department really says, to let the police department run the show, because people perceive the police department as a means to reducing crime, and the police department has a lot of money, consequently, because of the money we put in it to give back to the mayor. So the FOP is a huge political force, donates a lot of money to mayoral campaigns, has a lot of influence. So somehow you have to eliminate that. But I think more importantly is to get real civilian control of the police department. And what that means is looking at places like Toronto that has a civilian board that is some elected, partially appointed, that appoints the police commissioner. You've got to take the police commissioner's job out of the hands of the mayor, who already has too much power, and put it in the hands of a civilian board, I think, that has true control and that has a true say. I think the nexus of a police commissioner and a mayor is just too cozy. There has to be some oversight. It has to be substantive. Right now, our civilian review board has no power. No power whatsoever. We need real civilian oversight, real civilian intervention. Otherwise, nothing is going to change. What's funny about it is that the idea that you could police without the community, right? How on earth do you do that? I mean, a community should have the right to make its own values and create and have a say in what policing is. The idea that we even talk about it shows how absurd policing is, because obviously policing is an occupying force. It's a military force. If it's not community policing, what is it? It's something entirely different. Policing was one of the last branches of government to sort of evolve. And it was because I think people were wary of having people with guns and badges going around being able to make decisions about who should be free and who shouldn't be. So the idea that we have to discuss what community policing is or what it means shows that it has sort of evolved in a way that might have met some people's worst expectations. The only type of policing there is community policing. And I think what it means is that there is adequate civilian control and community input on how they want to be policed, right? And that there's adequate accountability for how policing is done. And that there is adequate relationship between the police department and the people they serve, so that the people who are policing don't live in Pennsylvania. All those elements, have to be present for policing to be effective. Here's the thing, community policing is the only thing that is effective. Because if the community isn't on your side and isn't with you, obviously you can't solve homicides, right? We have one of the lowest homicide rate closures this year, and we still have a high homicide rate. So if there's absolutely no bond between the police department and the community, policing doesn't work. It's something different. It's something military. It's something interventionist. It's something structurally unsound. So really, there is only one type of policing, and that's community policing, in my opinion. Well, I would say to that it's a very simple question, or there's a simple answer to that question. Has it been working thus far? Because it hasn't. Because we're one of the most violent cities in the country, and we have one of the largest police departments. So anyone can look at the logic and say, yes, I understand when you're a victim of a crime. I've been a victim of a crime multiple times. None of them have been solved. I mean, I had someone break into my house in the middle of the night while I was sleeping. That hasn't been solved. So I don't think, the problem is that we have created this idea that policing is a solution to the violence and the unrest in our neighborhoods, and that's not the truth. There's no evidence that it works. So if you say, well, maybe if we better educate people, we won't have as much criminality, or we won't have as much unrest and dissatisfaction, I think that's a perfectly plausible, logical argument. It won't be immediate as policing is, right? It will take time, but I think for us to continue to go on this path where we put almost all our resources into something that doesn't work is actually worse. We might as well suffer, a little bit of uncomfortableness with this idea that we do something different than to continue on the path we're on. The Law Enforcement Bill of Rights basically gives special rights to police officers that don't exist for normal people, when I say normal people that aren't police officers, and protects them. I mean, at this point, in Baltimore City, people might not understand this, but if an officer is accused of wrongdoing and a criminal investigation is started, they don't do the internal investigation in parallel. So the criminal investigation has to be completed and concluded, and then they go into the internal affairs investigation. That can draw out a process for years and years. And during that period of time, the officer is drawing a full salary. And usually, as we've seen, officers are rarely prosecuted. And then the internal disciplinary process has also been extremely flawed. Officers are rarely fired. They have lots of protections. They don't have to give a statement to their supervisors about an incident for 10 days, which is, absolutely not afforded to any other citizen. In fact, with the new body camera program, they just said the police officers have the right to review body camera footage before they're questioned about an incident. So they get to see the evidence before anybody asks them a question. So all these things culminate in the fact that there's no accountability. I mean, you can be literally, you commit a crime on the job, and you can't get fired. I mean, you can't fire. Now, the police commissioner has more power than they let on. I mean, he can fire people, but it's a long, long process. It's dragged out. And so the ability to say we had an officer, a police officer, Officer Kazem, who was seen on video beating up a guy, the ability to just fire someone for what I think everyone would accept to be inappropriate behavior is almost impossible. And the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights has a lot to do with that. And the efforts to reform in Annapolis were entirely unsuccessful because of the power of the FOP, the power of outlying jurisdictions that said, well, our cops are fine, I don't know what your problem is, and just the overall sense that any sort of hampering of police powers will somehow make the community less safe. I don't think there's evidence of that, but that's part of what drives it. The police department is actually a state agency, so it's very hard to reform it there. But the other thing to remember is that Baltimore City is kind of like a depository for poverty. I mean, the counties like Howard County and Hartford County exist because they're able to concentrate poverty here and build the walls that keep Baltimore self-contained and isolated. And I think to a certain extent, they don't want to see us do something else with the money or have a less powerful police department because they want to keep us at bay, and it's easy for them when you have a median income of $100,000 versus $40,000 or $30,000, when you don't have houses infested with lead paint like we do, when you don't have a city government that can't do an audit and account for any of the money they spend, and you don't have a police department that is continually being accused of physical aggression and killing residents unjustly, it's really easy to make the sort of assertion that policing is okay, or that somehow Baltimore just has problems that it can't fix. But those problems exist here because of those counties. They have consciously isolated this city. It's one of the few cities that isn't integrated into the county in terms of municipal structure and taxes. Taxes are twice as high, car insurance rates, they have concentrated poverty and inequality here. They benefit from it, they profit from it, and of course they want to keep our police force strong because, that's the way they're able to maintain this sort of unequal economic relationship. It exists primarily because of policing.